Now, as always, I'll start this out with a spoiler warning. If you haven't seen the latest episode of Clone Wars, which in this case is The Phantom Apprentice, and you don't want anything ruined, it is a really good time to click away. Okay, so that said, why not kick this off by talking about the duel? Visually, this was the most impressive thing I've seen in the history of this show by far, which is truly saying something because there have been other great or beautiful moments along the way, not to mention other fantastic duels, with Sidious vs. Maul and Oppress being one that immediately comes to mind. But this was a whole other level, thanks in large part, I'd imagine, to using motion capture and bringing in the original Darth Maul himself, Ray Park, to do it. I mean, it was so fluid that your brain forgets this is actually animated, it looks live action. And though I can only imagine that the amount of time and money put into these episodes in the Siege of Mandalore arc is significantly higher than what gets spent on, shall we say, average episode. If Lucasfilm can deliver anywhere near this level of animation quality in the future with a new show that is perhaps put on Disney Plus, or maybe finishing up some of those other Clone Wars arcs, then I don't think they'll have too many issues bringing in and keeping people subscribed to the service to pay for it. Anyway, as for the duel itself, well, I did see some people grumbling a bit in the comments last week that they didn't think Ahsoka should win this, which she did kinda do after what was a rather lengthy and pretty evenly matched fight, though Maul did have a moment towards the end where he had all but won. And I think what has to be remembered or kept in mind is that the amount of experience that Ahsoka has acquired in the last few years, how much practice she got during the Clone Wars, not to mention her master was Anakin Skywalker, which is a hell of a teacher to have. Still, I wouldn't have been upset if Maul was shown to fare a bit better here, especially when you consider Maul is so consumed by hate, anger, and rage at this point, which fuels the dark side, of course. While Ahsoka is a bit conflicted and maybe has some doubts about certain things, not to mention she could be a bit unbalanced after hearing Maul's accusation that Anakin was going to bring about destruction, that he was being groomed to become an apprentice to Sidious. And I really liked earlier in the episode when Obi-Wan told Ahsoka that Anakin had killed Dooku, and she didn't seem to know how to react to that. And speaking of that, I was grateful for that scene since it also established exactly where we are in the timeline, that we are now running parallel to Revenge of the Sith and getting ever closer to Order 66. I also like that Ahsoka seemed to know how foolish it was for the Jedi Council to make Anakin spy on Palpatine, that it was perhaps a disaster waiting to happen, which it, of course, was. But what probably stole the show here, or the episode, was just Maul all around. I remember how skeptical I was many years ago now, like 10 years ago in fact, when I heard they were bringing him back. And well, any and all doubts about that have long since evaporated, and the decision seems to be one of the best ever made by George Lucas, who was the one who wanted to do it, and basically told Filoni and company to make it happen. And I love that Maul knows exactly what's coming. I love that he stays relatively calm most of the time, but there are those few moments where he almost sounds like a mad prophet predicting doom and gloom. His motivations here, the first of which is to kill Anakin just to thwart his old master's plan, is perfectly in line with this rather tragic character who is always consumed with vengeance. He also knows that it's much too late to stop this, that Sidious's plan is about to come to fruition, or basically has come to fruition since he controls everything, and that Maul thinks he can survive and thrive in the coming chaos as he forms a criminal empire to take over the underworld. And I thought it was great that we got glimpses of both Dryden Voss from Solo and of course Xizor from Shadows of the Empire. That was a great little touch, and I wonder when or if we'll ever see more from Maul's Crimson Dawn, which likely would have been seen more if Solo 2 ever had been made. Anyway, setting aside some fun speculation of maybe some sort of Shadows of the Empire story making its way back into canon, I think one of my favorite moments in this episode is when Maul realizes just how devious Sidious is, if he hadn't long since already, that Sidious does not care about anything or anyone beyond his own ambition, that he uses everybody, that Dooku was also always one step behind him, and used the same way Maul was and cast aside as soon as he was no longer needed. And he of course points out to Ahsoka that he and her are very similar, that both served a higher power that didn't truly care about them and used them and cast them aside when their usefulness ran out, though of course Ahsoka does point out that's not exactly how it worked with her. And it almost does seem like till Maul said something about Anakin destroying everything, that Ahsoka considers his offer to work with him. Another thing I love about this episode is quite simply the name of it, how fitting it is and how many different meanings or characters the Phantom Apprentice could technically be referring to, though I think Anakin is clearly the one intended, that he's this looming threat behind the scenes about to become an apprentice to Sidious, that no one realizes is out there or looming, sort of how Palpatine was the Phantom Menace that no one realized was looming or behind the scenes back in episode 1. Anyway, the crazy part is, as good as this episode was, it's only part 2 of 4, which means this was mostly just set up for whatever comes next, whatever will happen in these final 2 episodes that will bring a proper close to this series. And I can honestly say, I'm not sure where they're going with this, especially with Maul already captured, though he could certainly escape and will obviously at some point. And there's a pretty good chance he will, considering what we've seen here isn't exactly lining up with what happened in the Ahsoka novel from years ago now, though technically it still could, I guess. And I don't want to go too much more into what happens in that book because I don't want to potentially spoil anything for anybody should that book still end up being what happens. Either way, it did show us how the Siege of Mandalore essentially ended, or once ended, and if they retcon it, so be it, I guess. I won't be overly upset because clearly that book was written before they knew they'd ever get a chance to revisit the Clone Wars and give it a proper ending. So I actually appreciate the effort to give us something back then. Not to mention, they don't have to retcon the whole book, since the Siege of Mandalore stuff is primarily covered in short interlude chapters. So in closing here, this was another fantastic episode, but I do think the best is yet to come, which again is crazy to think when you consider just how great the Maul vs. Ahsoka duel was, and you can just feel the impending doom that Maul keeps talking about drawing ever closer. You're just left holding your breath and waiting for what we know is going to come, waiting for Order 66 to be given, and to see what possibly happens between, say, Rex and Ahsoka. To steal the words of Gandalf from Lord of the Rings, this was the deep breath before the plunge. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you thought of this episode and what you think might happen next. How does the Clone Wars end? So leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.